Hello, everyone. We're just waiting for everyone to join. So I'm watching the numbers increase very quickly, and then I will formally open this evening's International Women's Day Jessie Street lecture. Well, welcome. It is just past the hour of 5 o'clock, and I know that people will still be joining us, but it's necessary to begin because we have a great lineup and we want to use the hour as fully as we can. So welcome to the 2022 Women and Work Research Group's 3rd annual Jessie Street International Women's Day lecture. I'd like to begin this evening's event by acknowledging country. I'd like to let you know that I'm hosting this webinar from the land of the Gadi people. It is on Gadigal land that the University of Sydney campuses are located, and we respectfully acknowledge their custodianship of land and all the meetings and exchanges of information and knowledge that have taken place here for over 60,000 years. My name is Marion Baird, and I'm Professor of Gender and Employment Relations at the University of Sydney and co-director of the Women and Work Research Group. With me are my colleagues Ray Cooper and Mariah Foley. And tonight we're honoured to call our annual International Women's Day lecture the Jessie Street Lecture, and we thank the Jessie Street Trust for permission to do so. As I mentioned earlier, this is the 3rd in our series of Jessie Street lectures. And we welcome Jessie Street Trust members to tonight's event, and especially descendants of Jessie Street who have attended our past lectures and this evening's. We also welcome members of the Women and Work Research Group Steering Committee who help our group with our decisions about what research we take and the actions and advocacy that we can do within our research remit. And we also welcome all our colleagues and friends in universities, in businesses, in unions and government who are joining us this evening. Thank you very much. It's great to have such a wonderful turnout. A little bit of background to Jessie Street. She lived from 1889 to 1970, and she was a formidable, energetic, determined and practical campaigner for the rights of women, not just in Australia, but internationally. She campaigned for the rights of women, Aboriginal people and the poor. She was a very sincere and determined campaigner for peace. These are all causes that continue, sadly, to be of relevance today. For Jessie Street, a woman's right to economic independence was paramount. And in her words, economic independence encompassed a right to income for married women, a right to paid employment, regardless of marital status, a right to compete alongside men in the labour market, a right to equal pay, and a right to just remuneration of skills. Jessie Street also strongly believed in respect for women. And these principles align directly with the research we do in the Women and Work Research Group here at the University of Sydney Business School. In the past 12 to 24 months, we've produced reports on access to flexibility during COVID, on COVID and the impact on women's economic participation. We've published papers on discrimination, sexism and harassment in highly regarded journals. All of our work is both academically rigorous and we hope designed to make a change to the way in which we operate in our workplaces and societies in the Pacific, the Asian region and internationally. So tonight I'm really delighted to say that we have the wonderful Kate Jenkins, Sex Discrimination Commissioner, to deliver this year's Jessie Street lecture. There's no better person than Kate in our current environment to give this evening's lecture. Before I introduce Kate more fully, I'd just like to let you know a couple of the rules for tonight. We are on a webinar, and you are able to enter any questions you have in the Q&A function. And there will be some time at the end of Kate's lecture for us to talk about those questions and for Kate to respond. The question and answer session will be moderated by Mariah and Ray. We're also wanting to let you know that the session is being recorded, and following the lecture, we will be able to upload the event onto our Women and Work Research Group website, and we'll be able to send you out the information about how to link into that. We'll also send you some direct information about other work we have been doing and give you an opportunity to join our mailing list. If this is the first time you've been with us, welcome. And we strongly encourage you to stay in contact. We run lots of events. COVID, of course, prevented some of them, but we'll continue to offer seminars Zoom and we hope live and various functions. So we look forward to seeing many of you at those events for the rest of this year. So back to tonight. As I said, we're absolutely delighted and honoured to have Kate Jenkins deliver this year's address. Kate is a member of the Australian Human Rights Commission. Her purpose is to advance gender equality consistent with the Sex Discrimination Act and the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination against Women. Kate is currently leading a number of projects, including actions to implement the wonderful Respect at Work report. Many of you will be very familiar with that, and here's the hard copy of that fantastic piece of work. Kate and the Commission's collaborative projects on cultural reform with both the Australian Defence Force and the Australian Federal Police are ongoing, as well as the independent review of Commonwealth parliamentary workplaces, which I'm sure many of you are across and may have questions about. Kate is also an ambassador for the FIFA 2023 Women's World Cup. Lovely to see Kate, thank you. Prior to joining the Commission, Kate spent 3 years as the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commissioner, years as lead equal opportunity partner with Herbert Smith Freehills, and many years serving on the boards of Berry Street Victoria, Heidi Museum of Modern Art, and the Carlton Football Club. Kate, we welcome you and really look forward to this evening's lecture, and thank you very much for being able to be here with us on the webinar and enabling us to reach so many people. Over to you. Thanks, Kate.
Thank you very much for that lovely welcome, Marion, and also for your work. Just if I forget, but for everyone here to know that Marion was both contributed to our surveys on sexual harassment and also on our reference group for the Respect at Work National Inquiry. So I am coming to you today from the lands of the Ngunnawal people. I must say it's a bit of a shock after having not travelled for a while to have started the day in Sydney when yesterday I was in Melbourne, but I will get used to that again, which was my past life, and I'm sure everyone's adjusting to returning to normal. It's a great honour to deliver this lecture in honour of the remarkable Lady Jessie Street. Some of you might have seen that I shared on my Twitter account this week a historic recording of Jessie Street held in our National Film and Sound Archive from May 1945, and I really, excuse me, commend you to have a listen to that. In it, she recounts the impressive collaboration and advocacy of Australian women that led to her attendance as the only Australian female delegate to the historic meeting at the United Nations Conference on International Organisation in San Francisco in 1945, hot on the heels and in fact in the dying days of World War II that led to the creation of the United Nations. And although 50 countries took part in the conference, there are only a handful of women to be included in the UN Charter. There was only a handful of women delegates to that. And at the event and in the radio interview, she describes how she and the other 11 or 10 women successfully fought for equality between men and women to be included in the UN Charter. 2 years later, she was elected Vice President of the new United Nations Commission on the Status of Women, a conference held every year where the UN countries reaffirm their commitments to gender equality and build on the achievements to date. And more than 70 years later, I'm pleased to say that I will attend CSW again this year. It starts next Monday, the 14th, as a member of the Australian delegation led by the Honourable Maurice Payne, with Christine Clark, the new Ambassador for Women and Girls, Mary Wooldridge, the Director of the Workplace Gender Equality Agency, and Kayleen Zakharoff, the Head of the Office for Women, as well as the Australian Ambassador to the UN, Mitch Fifield, who is in New York. Due to COVID restrictions this year, CSW will be mostly remote, so I will be attending from Australia. As Marion's already mentioned, Jessie Street was born in 1889 and she died just 2 years after my birth in 1970. Her activism in her lifetime covered many of the areas we continue to focus on: rights for women in work, in education, in politics, in sport, Aboriginal constitutional recognition. And when you listen to Jessie, you realise how long this fight for gender equality has been going and how amazing some of the people that have come before us are. And that could be depressing, but for me, it's also inspiring. So picking up on the spirit of Jessie Street today, I'd like to focus on the encouraging momentum in Australia in the last 12 months, and in particular on 3 interconnected areas to show how and why we could be and should be optimistic about change. I'm going to talk about the progress on respect at work, the lessons from our parliamentary review, and the impact of the visibility and voices of women, especially the younger women that we're seeing at the moment. One of my happiest professional moments was last year on the 15th of March, getting a photo from a friend and colleague who was attending the March for Justice in Sydney while I was in Canberra. And it showed someone holding a placard that simply read, "Respect at work, implement the 55." So let me start with a recap on the National Inquiry into Sexual Harassment in Australian Workplaces that I led in the Australian Human Rights Commission from 2018, and which resulted in our report Respect at Work, which was tabled in Parliament on the 5th of March 2020, so almost exactly 2 years ago. And thank you, Marion, for having your copy close handy. The inquiry was commenced in June 2018 off the back of the momentum of Harvey Weinstein's allegations and the global Me Too conversation, and also off the back in Australia of the long-term advocacy, especially from Australian women and unions. At the time, I had been working as an employment lawyer in sexual harassment cases for 25 years. And I remember in 2017 and 18 saying it felt like it was a real turning point. The Human Rights Commission had been conducting regular national surveys since 2003. In fact, Prue Goward started the first survey and was due to conduct its 4th survey in 2018. We'd also conducted a survey of the student experience of sexual harassment and sexual assault in 39 Australian universities in 2017, and I hope some of you participating will recall that. And so the announcement of the inquiry was a world first examination of the state of sexual harassment across all Australian workplaces. And as I mentioned, we were supported by a terrific reference group that included Marion. The report that was produced as a result of the inquiry is lengthy and did make 55 recommendations. To super simplify the key findings, which are backed by substantial evidence, We found that sexual harassment is still prevalent in Australian workplaces. 1 in 3 Australian workers had experienced sexual harassment in the previous 5 years. In fact, 85% of women have experienced sexual harassment over their lifetime. But as some of you will know, I quite regularly stick to that 5-year period because it's tempting for everyone to say this is something in the past. So it's important to realise it's happening now. It affects less powerful workers, the young, women more than men, but men as well, insecure workers, LGBTI communities, people with disabilities. We produced industry data in 2018 for the first time, and it was very helpful. And some of the momentum we've seen, particularly in mining, was really triggered as a result of seeing some of the shocking numbers. In mining, the statistics said that 40% of workers had experienced sexual harassment, but that came down to 74% of men and 74% of women and 32% of men. We found, as we have over the last 20 years, that reporting in Australia is very low. Only 17% of people who've experienced sexual harassment have reported it. And I believe that is very unlikely to change. We found that sexual harassment in our workplaces is extremely costly, and the Deloitte Access Economics assessment found that it was $3.8 billion cost in the year 2018 conservatively. We particularly found there is currently a system that relies on complaints and that there is no positive duty in the main piece of legislation that prohibits sexual harassment, which is the Sex Discrimination Act. And that is why one of the recommendations is to introduce a positive duty, and I will come back to that shortly. So we found that in practice, workplace action has been prioritising stopping complaints rather than stopping sexual harassment, and using secrecy to protect organisations' reputations. We found that sexual harassment should be treated as a safety workplace and a human rights issue, and that workplace focus needs to shift towards prevention, recognising the systemic nature of the issue and recognising that safety approaches and taking industry action will work the best. We made 55 recommendations around 5 key areas of focus: more and better data and research, primary prevention functions outside the workplace, especially in the community, media and education, improve legal and regulatory framework and coordination, improved workplace prevention and response, and better support, advice and advocacy services. So what has happened since March 2020? Firstly, COVID, which meant that my planned trip to the 2020 CSW was immediately cancelled, and so were my plans to share the findings of our inquiry, which has been of great interest internationally. Also, my attention did need to turn to the disparate impact of COVID and the restrictions that were put in place on women, as it did for many of you. But the media reporting of sexual harassment did not stop, and that is even to today. So the most high profile over the period, I would say, were in the High Court, at the University of Adelaide, for AMP, in our Parliament. Corporates started to act in 2020, and in particular, notably, the legal sector, the mining sector. The Australian Institute of Company Directors started producing resources for directors, and the regulators, including Safe Work Australia, Comcare, Fair Work Commission and Fair Work Ombudsman, all started taking action. And thank you, unions and women's groups and academics and anyone who'd followed the inquiry didn't forget about it. And in 2021, that momentum continued, with Grace Tame appointed as Australian of the Year, and as you know, Brittany Higgins speaking out, and also Chanel Contos starting the petition on the experience in private single-sex schools in Sydney of sexual assault. So under the new Attorney General, and with the support of the Cabinet and the PM, on 18th of April 2021, the government issued their response to the Respect at Work report, called the Roadmap to Respect, and also provided significant funding. The response accepted in whole, in part, in principle, or noted all 55 recommendations. And I will take this moment to tell you that in practice, despite a range of social media sort of snapshots that seem to suggest that only 6 in 55 have been actioned. In fact, almost all of those recommendations have been actioned, funded, or are in train. So there has been a sort of confusion about what had occurred, and there was conversations about which recommendations have been progressed, but in practice, a whole lot of action has occurred. Not all have been completed, but there has been huge progress. In particular, I chair the Respect at Work Council that brings together regulators, worker representatives, and employer groups. There's been legislative action, and there is currently a consultation underway. There's been meetings of Attorney Generals across the country to talk about what state and territory action is taken. There's been significant education and resources prepared, reporting data and safety resources. There's been funding of research and primary prevention initiatives, and the next survey is due and is being run by the Human Rights Commission this year. In terms of support, advice and advocacy, 1800-RESPECT is now funded to provide advice and support on sexual harassment, and there's been a significant funding boost to legal services, although there is still a concern about how that funding can flow through to working women's centres. And there's been significant industry action. Most high profile, as I've said, has been mining, parliament and legal, but these are not the only industries that have acted. They're also not the only industries that require attention. And as Ray knows, retail, hospitality, social assistance, there's a range of sectors that really need urgent attention. I guess before I go on to talking about, I think, our most high profile industry being Parliament, I will just do a bit of a call out for the current consultation by the Attorney General's Department. So 6 of the legislative amendments, including the recommendation about the positive duty in the Sex Discrimination Act, are currently out for consultation through the Attorney General's Department. I have pinned the link to that, which is open until the 18th of March, to the top of my Twitter account, or you can look up AG Consultation Respect at Work and find it there. When you go there, you can also see the government's update on the progress against all of the 55 recommendations. So if you're interested to know how they've been responded to, I encourage you to participate. It's actually in the format of a survey, and there are straightforward questions like, do you support a positive duty? So just to give you something that you can do practically, I know that government will pay attention depending on what the responses are. So I'd encourage you to have a look at it. So this then brings me to the most high profile industry that was the subject of our independent review of Commonwealth parliamentary workplaces, which was also announced just over 1 year ago on the 5th of March last year, exactly 1 year after Respect at Work. And I'll come to the new announcement that happened on the 6th of March, which has my team getting very concerned about the dates of the 5th and the 6th of March in terms of workload, but I'm very pleased with these progressing. So we were engaged to cover the experience of working in Commonwealth parliamentary workplaces, which includes Parliament House and electoral offices, and also covers parliamentarian staff as public servants and private sector workers like the media. The process happened over 7 months. We had 1,700 participants, including more than 900 people surveyed and almost 500 interviews. Interestingly, almost 150 of them were current or former politicians. Our findings were that in the current Parliament, there are 51% of people had experienced bullying, sexual harassment, or actual or attempted sexual assault. And the reporting was even lower than the national average. Only 11% of people who'd experienced sexual harassment reported it. We found the drivers of the misconduct were power imbalances, gender inequality, lack of accountability, and entitlement and exclusion, or really lack of diversity. We found in Parliament there were particular risk factors in the working environment, including unclear and inconsistent standards of behaviour. We saw a people leadership deficit, a focus really on the politics rather than the people, and the workplace dynamics of loyalty and trust really driving how work was done. We saw really challenging social conditions of work, long hours, 24/7, fly in, fly out, really intersections of work and personal. And we also saw that the employment structures, conditions and systems varied right across the board, from MOPS Act or Members of Parliament Staff Act, workers, elected representatives, public servants and private sector employers. We recommended 5 shifts in our framework for action, including 28 recommendations. And in particular, we recommended improved institutional and individual leadership, especially for people management, diversity, equality and inclusion, better systems to support performance, standards reporting and accountability improvements, and a focus on safety and wellbeing. And we made recommendations because we've learnt over time that the recommendations which were interconnected, we gave really an implementation plan over a period of 2 years, with the most urgent to be actioned before the next election, so the new class of 2022 can start on a better footing to quickly perform to a higher level and support prevention of this sort of misconduct. And just to tell you in advance that, in fact, across Parliament, all 28 recommendations have been accepted, including the timeframes that we recommended. And you may not know, but there's already been significant action. We delivered the report on the 29th of November last year. It was tabled in Parliament on the 30th of November, which was the last sitting day. And on the first sitting day of return, there was an acknowledgement and apologies in both houses of Parliament. There have already been laws passed amending the MOPS Act to ensure that the discrimination, Fair Work, Unfair Dismissal and OH&S laws do properly apply to those workers. A full review of the MOPS Act has been commissioned. A task force to implement our recommendations has been established, and a joint parliamentary committee on standards and significant budget has been allocated. The final area that I wanted to focus is really what was happening while we were conducting that parliamentary review. There was significant advocacy and cross-generational demands for change. COVID has spotlighted the discriminatory impact of unpaid caring on women's economic security and job opportunities. And so, as including some of the people on this call, there's been active advocacy that has engaged business and governments already, leading to reform of the childcare and tax system. There's also been strong engagement in consent education in schools. Teachers' Consent, led by Chanel Contos, led to a February commitment for national mandatory consent education to be introduced into the curriculum in 2023. After many years of there being hot debate about whether we should talk about sex and school children and school youth, it was remarkable the change that Chanel and her friends and peers could advocate for in a short time. There's also been active engagement in the development of the next National Action Plan for the Prevention of Violence Against Women and their Children, with the first one established in 2010 coming to an end in this year, and the new plan due for release soon. And finally, announced yesterday on my days of blurring, on Sunday the 6th of March, a significant additional funding announcement, including $5 million to the Human Rights Commission to conduct a national survey with Chanel Contos as a special advisor. And that survey is to look at the experiences of consent education and sexual harassment in schools, which adds a very important piece of the puzzle, one that really became evident to us from my predecessors and to the Commission, and particularly for me through the work in defence and through the university's work, the National Inquiry, and also when you look at ABS data and the National Community Attitudes Survey. So that is a cause for great optimism when you think about what has happened in the last 12 months. So if Jessie Street was here, I think she would be very pleased to see what has been happening over the last 5 years, culminating in the last 12 months. I really think she would feel very positive about the change that is happening and the legacy that we are continued. So this speech was titled Respect at Work, Making It Happen. So Marion suggested I give you a couple of, I guess, what's often called call to actions or things that you can do. So I guess the first thing I could say, and I don't say this very much, but lots has happened on respect at work. So I don't want you to be down or disillusioned. There is, obviously we're coming to an election and I understand the discussion about women. I welcome that is a very important topic for consideration as we think over how we vote. But some social media I see is still saying that only 6 of the 55 recommendations have been implemented. And that is simply not true. And it's a bit depressing and not good for the Human Rights Commission for you to think that, you know, we do all this work and nothing happens. In fact, lots has happened since the 18th of April last year. And when I said it felt different as someone who'd been a legal practitioner in the sexual harassment area, I did say that in 2017 and 18, particularly in 18, where the conversation was continuing. In 2022, I hope that at least some Australian workers feel like it's different, know it's different, have experienced better workplaces. In relation to respect at work, though, there is something that I've already mentioned that I would really love your engagement in, and that is this public consultation about the further legislative reform. So I think the initial reform, which is also very important and went through in September of last year, has introduced things like the new Stop Sexual Harassment order in the bullying jurisdiction in Fair Work. It extended the time frame for a complaint from 6 months to 2 years, and there's several other really important changes. So the next 6 that are being currently consulted on were a little bit more complex, and that is why the consultation is available. And it is really easy to participate. Yes, you can write something if you want, but actually you could just go through and answer the various questions. It is the way of government now, and I can totally understand to do surveys, and I'd encourage you to do that. If you're also interested, when you look at that, you can also see that government progress update, and that should be a place that you can go back to see the changes. And if you're also interested to know, the Respect at Work Council that I chair also has a page that you can register to get updates and be invited to forums and see our annual report. So there is good information there. The third thing I would encourage you to do on the ground is to use your voice within the workplace. Well, I haven't talked a lot about it. I note that the AMP situation where someone had been promoted who was accepted, had previously been found to have engaged in sexual harassment. AMP changed their decision, their leadership and their governance, actually originally because workers objected, and then investors objected, and then the Fin Review did a spotlight on this. And I don't disregard the importance of that worker's voice to guide leadership in what they should respond to. You all know that the Commonwealth Parliamentary Workplace Review occurred primarily because Brittany Higgins spoke up about her allegations, and supported by others who also had previously spoken up. So helping amplify other voices as well as using yours, and other voices that are often not heard, diverse voices, is something you can also do. And in terms of workplaces, the other thing that I've already mentioned too is ask for actions for leaders and remind them of the evidence. So our survey is going to be conducted again this year. So you'll get more industry data, which will be quite helpful. But there's also great resources from the Human Rights Commission, supported by the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors. We did a report called Equality Across the Board for guidance for boards. Chief Executive Women has a website now that helps people understand some resources on having conversations about what should be done. And as I've mentioned, the Australian Institute of Company Directors has some terrific resources, as well as a new platform or website called Respect at Work will be launched in about May of this year to be a central place for all the resources. The last call out that I will do is, I guess, just a plug for supporting the Australian Human Rights Commission. We're a unique beast with an amazing intersection of expertise, insight, independence, and public trust. Every piece of work I've showcased today happened because of external funding, and for most of them from government funding. But sometimes the important work we need to do is not popular with government or funders. Jessie Street would want to know Australia had a strong independent Human Rights Commission that was adequately funded for our core purpose to continue her legacy. So your vocal support of our work matters to us. Being able to do work on gender equality, on disability rights, on racism and more. And really, it's a call out, but also a thank you. We really appreciate the support we get. So I'm very happy now, I think Ray and Mariah and Marion, to pass back to you and to answer any questions that participants might have.
Thanks, Kate. We have got questions rolling in, and I'll just remind people, get in very fast because we only have about 15 minutes to ask Kate the burning questions, and you need to do that in the Q&A function. Okay, so I'm going to start with the first person who came in, who's one of our really wonderful colleagues, Katie Moore. And she asks, so Kate, how can we ensure that we embed a cultural lens as well as other elements of intersectionality into all of our gender equality conversations and advocacy?
It's such an important conversation. I think even at the time of the parliamentary report being released, you know, the constant comment is, and it's not a criticism of those people, but the people that are being listened to tend to be, you know, sort of in the more privileged, generally white, Anglo-Saxon, able-bodied. And there's a couple of things going on. In a workplace sense, I do think a lot of workplaces have not, you know, the expertise or the practical sits in HR or lawyers, and the recognition about gender, about trauma, and about intersectionality is almost expertise that doesn't exist in those organisations. If I think of my 20 years of practice, it definitely didn't exist. And I would say even now, it's one of the most common sort of lacks in an organisation. So, I mean, if I go to an organisational point of view, I would say for organisations, you need to like really embrace this, not just, you know, your aim isn't often to, so the first comment I'd make is the aim isn't for you to get a whole lot more people to complain. The aim is that you are taking prevention actions, but those prevention actions have to recognise that different people experience workplaces and disadvantaged differently. And multicultural communities are important. Migrant workers in particular, our Respect at Work inquiry found, were some of the most vulnerable workers. If you've got language barriers, lack of understanding of the laws, you know, insecure work and visa, you know, potential to lose visa, it's almost impossible for you to do anything. The other group that I really came away from the Respect to Work inquiry was the LGBTI community, their vulnerability in sexual harassment, where, you know, that I remember someone say, we get sexually harassed in the same way as everyone else, and then we have our own extra version, which is questions about our sexual activity or about our body parts, or, you know, a whole lot of things that are just so outrageous. And because of the lack of either not wanting to come out, lack of training that even recognises that that might be a different experience. So I guess, I mean, I'm sure people on would have even better suggestions, But I think if I think about workplace sexual harassment, I think workplaces have really struggled to bring that in, but it is changing.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you, Kate. We have another question. This one is from Monica Rose, thanking you for all the work that you do and appreciating your contributions. The question is about the culture of Parliament and your views on how question time affects that culture of Parliament as a workplace. She writes, "It's the most public-facing part of the day-to-day work, and I've always enjoyed the theatre of it, but I now feel that the nature of it has terrible consequences. I was especially disappointed in the week of the apology in Parliament to see the immediate return to name-calling and disrespectful behaviour. Do you think this needs to change?"
One of our recommendations is a great question. One of our recommendations was about reviewing sort of the standing orders. So like every organisation, you know, even when you look at the recommendation about implementing, you know, a code of conduct for parliamentarians, for staffers and some standards, you know, there was some of this where we're like, well, you know, this is a workplace, but then there's a point where I thought, well, even at my kids' local soccer club, there's kind of some just minimum standards of respectful engagement. Having said that, so we did recommend that be reviewed, but our inquiry really, it was really clear that you can draw a distinction between the adversarial and oppositional nature of what happens in Parliament. So we didn't come up with a report that said you can't disagree, because that in fact is what we want. We want people to be there to be able to have robust discussions. And so what we have proposed doesn't say, because there was lots of the conversations, people are saying you can't come in and say, you know, this is the point, we have to have robust discussions, including on marriage equality, including on the religious discrimination bill, and it can be harmful, but that's part of the job. My comment on that is question time is one part of the parliamentary workplace, but when we looked at the workplace as a whole, and I guess I'm really, you know, everyone I spoke to is there because they want to make Australia a better place and they want to contribute. And there was in the workplace, there weren't all the right structures to support people to perform to their best. When we elect them, the next day, someone who's never worked there before will start working with 4 staff, of whom right now, and I've spoken to a couple of the candidates who said, I feel like it's bad luck to start thinking about who my staff will be. And I'm like, oh, we'll start thinking about it. I can now understand, I'm going off track here, but I can now understand why the US elects in November and they commence in January. Imagine having 2 months to then get yourself organised, up and ready, running. And so my broad comment is our recommendations really don't just say there's one little thing that needs to change. There is no doubt, I appeared before Senate estimates, there's no doubt when you have a good chair and you have a good presiding officer, the conversations are more respectful. They can their standing orders can set some rules about what they do have rules. You know, children are off limits, staff are off limits. So they do some things. So they can definitely improve it. But I'm not saying you shouldn't have question time where it's pretty robust. But yes, I think there's a change. And I think that it undermines the respect for our democracy of the Australian people. And that reason alone is a good reason to improve the calibre of what happens in that place.
Thanks, Kate. Now, I'm going to try to put together 2 questions which come from different sort of sectors, but I think it really, they really relate to each other. One is from Ash, who's asking about what advice do you have for women in particular working in very male-dominated environments where voices and requests for change are blocked. And when women do report, they feel that they're going to be singled out and punished. And then I'm going to put that with another one of this is an anonymous one of our students who is here at the School of Engineering. And they're asking, I'm a woman in the School of Engineering. I've been trying to get people to concentrate on bad culture and some of the matters that are being discussed today. None of these behaviours are being taken seriously, and sexual harassment happens on a daily basis. What can we do? Is what they're both asking you, Kate.
Yeah, these are great questions. A couple of things. One is the external climate is really helping. So those questions could have been asked when I was at university, almost exactly the same question. And in fact, I specifically didn't do engineering because when I came in, I was a math science student and it just looked so hard that I chose law, which, had gender balance. So really good question. The external climate at the moment is creating a license and also some momentum to start a conversation with leadership that is, rather than a specific complaint, really start questioning, as those workers did at AMP, as a collective, if you possibly can. So if there's more of you, to start saying, we are concerned. Universities, so if you're talking in a university, 2017 was when we did our survey, and that was just for the student experience. The next survey is due out any minute now, that has been conducted, I think, by ANU. So you will have a trigger in the university sector to start that conversation. In other male-dominated sectors, if you're interested just to get some things up your sleeve, there is a section in the Respect at Work report that specifically talks about industries and some of the risk factors in male-dominated industries, and that is a big reason why the mining sector and construction also have started paying attention. But there's also a couple of resources around. So if I think of that first question, I think it was Ashley, Chief Executive Women is a group of basically women CEOs, but it's about 600 or 700. Sam Mostyn is the chair at the moment. And it almost driven by the same outrage as those two questioners. When the Respect at Work report came out and all the data, these senior women who were sitting at board tables said, right, we need to do something about this. But they also noted that they were often the lone voice at the board table. And they said, you know what, it can be really hard to raise this to be heard. So I would really now... I think it's called Respect is Everyone's Business. And I should know this, but that's a combination of two of my reports. So I get a bit confused about it. But if you look Chief Executive Women Respect, you'll find a whole lot of resources that might be useful for boards, but it's actually useful for what would you be asking. And the other place I would suggest is our Human Rights Commission. We did this report, Equality Across the Board. It looked at the experience of board and leadership in the ASX 200, but actually was driven by ACSI, the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, who said we want to question the organisations we're investing in, and we want to know what questions we should be asking them. And so to some degree that gives some answers to the organisations, but it does people who want to speak to their leadership. So if you've got a complaint, you should look at and seek supports, call 1-800-RESPECT, call the Human Rights Commission, go to your organisation. I would absolutely say that. But if you are thinking, look, I don't want to take a particular complaint, but I do want to start rattling the cages and getting some action, then getting a group together and looking at those resources and starting looking up and saying, what are you doing? I can guarantee you at those tables, when AMP hit the newspapers and then when Brittany Higgins' disclosures hit the newspapers, I know boards and universities all sat around and said, what would we do if that happened here? And in many cases, they did not know. So I'm pretty confident that if you start asking now, we've got an authorising environment or a climate where, those questions are taken more seriously. So that's, again, a reason why I'm optimistic, because in my day, it wouldn't have been, and everyone would have said, she's, what happened to her? She's just difficult. It's not a problem.
Yeah, thank you, Kate. And can I also say to the student who asked that question, if you feel comfortable to email me, go right ahead, and I'm really happy to take your question and put you in touch with people that you might need to be in touch with. Okay, Mariah's got another question.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Now I'm going to compress together a couple of questions. One, I think, by one of our academic colleagues, one, I think, from a reporter in the audience, and another one from an anonymous person. And the crux of them are that you, Kate, thanking you again for your work and saying that you sound very positive about the action that's been taken so far by the government. But there are a number of questions about whether or not the government is actually doing enough. And one person has mentioned in particular, for example, saying, quote, the recent way in which Minister Tudge was seemingly able to step away from serious allegations seemed like a disturbing continuation of the downplaying of sexual harassment in Parliament. And another questioner asks whether enough has been done to reform the Fair Work Act around sexual harassment. So the question is, do you think this government has done enough? And are you positive about the potential for change?
As you'd already anticipate, I'm not giving a report card on this government. And one of the thoughts that for the last 12 months I've really had in my mind was, how do you write about politics without getting political? In terms of the people questioning the media spotlight, these are all good questions to have about, as we come to an election, but also in our workplaces. Do we think how our leaders are responding to these issues are appropriate, and are they modern? I'm really optimistic because my dealings with all sides of our parliament in our it was quite a privilege to do our independent review and to see that there is absolutely an appetite for change in all sides and all parts of parliament and at all levels. And so when we produced our report, and always you're always ready for objections and denials and people pulling apart. Academics would know this, the research was wrong, that whatever it might be. While I think the reporting in a public sense was saying this is quite shocking, the messages I got from within Parliament was, no, you've captured, the stresses and the weird, that's probably an unkind word, the really unique culture and environment that works here, the unique way they have to work. And they, across the board, welcomed that the recommendations of solutions were the right ones. So if I look at the reporting over the last couple of years about complaints and what would happen under the new recommended system, which wasn't in place for the current circumstances, but will soon be in place, there would be a place for the workers to go to get advice, even confidentially. There would be a place for those workers to also go to an independent Parliamentary Standards Commission to get support and make a formal complaint in a way that could result in findings, and even for parliamentarians can result in consequences. Up until now, there haven't been those systems in place. So I'm not going to make a comment on a particular case, but what we were really mindful of was there were a whole range of things that kind of felt like they went off the rails. But then when we looked hard, were there clear standards? Were there places to report? Were there accountability mechanisms? The answer was no. And the answer was they need quite unique solutions, because this is it's a Westminster system. These are elected officials. We can't pretend like we can sack them, like you might terminate the employment of a senior executive. So it simply is not the same as a normal, our most workplaces in that sense. So I feel really optimistic that the solutions we've provided will make a significant difference. Does that mean that everyone will be perfect going forward? No, it does not. But does that mean that the standards will be clear and people will have places to go and it will be safer? And most importantly, people will be able to perform their jobs really well, which is what we want. then I absolutely think we will have that environment for us in our parliament. And I hope at a state level and at local government level, they are also looking at that report and taking the lessons and applying the same, because the driving circumstances are similar in those environments.
Okay, I've got a question from one of our favourite people, which is Eva Cox, who's asking, I think, the opposite question to what we normally ask, which is, you know, you often hear it stated that, you know, these things, these gender inequalities and harassments and violence is brought to the workplace from society. But she's asking, I think, I've stopped being able to see the question, she's asking, what impact does the workplace actually have on society in terms of these gender-based violences?
Yeah, that's a great question. And Eva and many will know the framework that Australia has, the Change the Story framework, that really recognises that there's not one thing to do. We need to do multiple initiatives in high impact settings for change. I absolutely think that the workplace does impact our society as a whole. It is such an important location, particularly for gender equality. So my 3 priorities, as is the priorities for most people who do work in gender, are about women's economic security, women's leadership opportunities, and violence against women. And the workplace is both the problem and the solution for a lot of those, all 3 of those issues. And in particular, that question could go to, I know when we did the universities work, people said, why are you focusing on universities? You know, that's the sort of the kind of privileged group. But the reality was, and you'll know this better, but as I recall, 5% of our population at any point in time is at university. Then they have families and friends, or they're former graduates, and our leaders pretty much have all attended university. So my view was, this isn't just one group, the reach is big. Similar comments were made when I was in Victoria and doing work with Victoria Police. And people are saying, why is the Human Rights Commission focusing on police? And at that time, I think we had about 60 staff, and they had 21,000 people across the state of Victoria who on a daily basis were interfering with people's human rights in a good way or a bad way. And I even then said, if I can change Victoria Police, I can change the state of Victoria. The same answer applies to our Commonwealth Parliament. I guess the work that we did last year is a big investment in what some might say a small workforce, but actually it's really critical. It's such a role model example, and we did call the report Set the Standard for a reason, that not only will that help the decision making that we get as a country, which is very much in our interests, but role modelling how workplaces should be working will have a much bigger impact. This is a place where so many people aspire to work. The average length of service of the staffers is actually only 1 to 2 years. But we interviewed people that were current and former staffers, and they're everywhere. So I'm sure on this, there will be a ton of people who have worked in Parliament at some point in some capacity. So a bit like my university students, staffers and people who've worked in Parliament are everywhere. And in fact, they take great skills and know how the country works. So it's really in our interest that that's a great place to work, because not because they're there forever, but because they transition through, they do good work, and then they go to other places. And as opposed to what we heard, there was lots of people who said that was their first job, and when they got out, they were quite shocked to discover what a job description was, what a performance management discussion was, all the normal practices. We hope that the exact opposite will be the case, that they'll be able to go out and say, this is how you do it well.
Thanks, Kate. I think we have to end there. We're coming right up to the 6 p.m, but there are a number of great questions there. We'll keep those questions on record, and if we can, respond and let Kate know what the rest of the questions were. I want to say thanks very much to Kate, Ray and Mariah for facilitating, for really engaging in those questions. But I also want to thank the 200 plus people who joined our webinar this evening. It's our pleasure, and in fact our privilege that we're able to research in this area and to try and impact change for good. One of the questions that came in from Cecilia was, how do we all keep doing it? And I know that there are times when everyone in life feels like I can't do it anymore. But the big thing is working together. It's really important, knowing that you do have.
I think that'll be the old University of Sydney Wi-Fi. So I don't know whether Marion knows that she's frozen, but I know that what she was going to say before we end up at 6 is thank you, Kate. You are a star. It's been wonderful collaborating with you. I know she's back.
Happy International Women's Day.
Happy International Women's Day. That's what I was just going to say, MB.
Thank you, everyone. I think we're having some technical problems now, but thanks a lot. Thanks, Kate.
Thank
Appreciate your work so much. And I encourage everyone to go onto that website to answer the survey, the Attorney General's website, the consultation survey. Thanks, everyone. And again, happy Women's Day. And thanks, Jessie Street, for inspiring us and continuing to inspire us. Good night.